Well, hello and welcome to this presentation on stopping procrastination with hypnotherapy. So my name's Gordian Young. I'm from the Institute of Applied Psychology. If my credentials are important to you, then here they are. I've been the chair or the president of different associations. I'm a clinical supervisor. I'm the former editor of the journal, the only peer-reviewed journal in the space. I'm a published author in the field. I run Sydney Hypnotherapists, and I'm the only government-accredited trainer to ever been accepted into the Milton H. Erickson Foundation in Phoenix, Arizona. I consider this to be a big part of why what I do is different from everyone else here in Australia. And I was also included in the largest study of leadership in the Southern Hemisphere, where they looked at 100 different fields and interviewed who they deemed to be the leader in the field. And in this field, they chose me. So let's begin. So, the other point we need to make here is that we're the ones who wrote the book. So we teach something called strategic psychotherapy. We didn't invent strategic psychotherapy, but we're the ones who've written the clinician's guide too. We run something called the Gordian pillars, and this is a framework for breaking down pretty well anyone's problem into component parts, and when you break it down, then it becomes much, much easier to address. That right now is only available to our own students, but it will eventually, probably by the end of the year, we will make it available on Amazon. So tonight's overview, what are we going to look at here? Well, what is procrastination? You have to define something before you can realistically talk about it. We're going to look at the myths of procrastination because the myths get in the way. When you think procrastination is one thing, then you're going to treat it differently than if you recognize it's something else. So a lot of the myth around a lot of conditions that people have, a lot of problems people get stuck with, unfortunately the personal development field has actually oversimplified it in many ways, and in many ways makes it fairly intractable to deal with. Why do we procrastinate? If you procrastinate, then, and who hasn't procrastinated, why do you do it? It's useful to know. And how do we advance you and others around you beyond any limitations that you might have or have had? So you may have questions. Please put them in the chat. I'll literally go through this PowerPoint, and then I'll look at your questions at the end if that's okay. In many cases, the answer to your question will be in the PowerPoint, hopefully. So let's look at this. Well, what is procrastination? Well, procrastination is a noun. And a noun is it's an item or a thing. So the action of delaying or postponing something is what procrastination is. The truth is, procrastination is a process. It's a verb. There is no such thing as procrastination. It doesn't exist in the real world. You can't put it in an envelope and send it to me. So this is one of the pitfalls of the way we label things. When you talk about procrastination and you talk about we've got to get rid of procrastination, then you're really already in the wrong space. Procrastination is a verb. You are procrastinating, and you have to do certain things to procrastinate. So right there's a gap. So what are the myths of procrastination? Well, a lot of the time people talk about it being a personality issue or an identity issue. And a lot of people label themselves as maybe flawed or lazy or indolent or something. That all comes back to they're just not good enough in some way. Now, I'm not saying it's not possible that you're lazy, but what I would say to you is that it's going to be among the last things I'm going to look at. The idea that it's a personality or identity issue implies that it's something inherent to you. I'm going to argue that's unlikely to be the case. Another sort of related element to that is that it's part of how you self-sabotage. There's a lot of talk out there about people fearing success, and so procrastination is the way they self-sabotage. And I'm going to say to you that just isn't true. I'm going to argue that there's no such thing as self-sabotage, at least in the way that most people refer to it. You don't self-sabotage in order to avoid success. There is no such thing as a fear of success. You might have a fear of falling from a greater height. You may fear getting it wrong or procrastinating. Procrastinating because you don't know whether you can get it right or not. You may fear not being able to do it the way you want to do it, but you don't fear success. If you suddenly had $5 million in the bank and you didn't have to do anything particular for it, I don't know that many of you would say, oh, I'm not comfortable with that. Or if you have suddenly got promoted and obviously you could do the job, I don't think many people would be uncomfortable with that. So this idea, it's a very common one, that an unconscious fear of success is the reason why people do what they do, I'm going to say is just not true. Yeah? I'll explain why later. The third one is often a very common one, the idea that you lack motivation, therefore you can't take the action. Here's one thing I would say to you. The most successful people on the planet are action-oriented people. They're goal-oriented and they're action-oriented. The real world does not respond to your feelings. It doesn't respond to your ideas. Right? At the end of the day, you either take action or you don't. If you want to get an outcome, you need to do things to get it. An outcome is a verb. It's a result of you taking actions. So if you're waiting for this magical thing called motivation to hit you before you can take an action, then you are listening to your feelings too much. Motivation is not something that effective people wait for. What happens is they start taking action, whether they feel like it or not, and as a result of getting some traction, they step into being more motivated. But they're not waiting for motivation first. That is the cart before the horse. So that is a problem in the way you process your strategy. Right? So if you can't take an action without the right feeling being in place, then you are going to be inconsistent in your results. There's no getting around that. So that's also one of the reasons why you might get stuck. So if it's not these things, what is it really? Well, one of the things will be ambiguity. Whenever you're going to take an action, maybe a new project or something, there will be unknowns about it. Now, many people have what's referred to as an intolerance for ambiguity. That is to say, they're not comfortable with the unknowns. And the more you have a high need for control, the more you lean towards perfectionism, the higher your need for certainty. If you look at what anxiety is at the end of the day, it is purely the fear of the unknown. That's all it is. You don't fear what you know. You fear what you don't know. And the only reason why you can fear what you don't know is you assume that in those uncertain spaces, bad things will happen. So the what if question is the way people lead themselves down the pathway of anxiety. What if this goes pear-shaped? What if I can't do it? What if I look silly? What if I? So the ambiguity will get in the way, particularly if it's something that you're not really sure how to do. And that can hold people up. They don't want to get it wrong. They don't really know where to start, and so they don't start. They also will typically have a poor process. That is to say, there'll be a gap in their steps. It's like everything you do, it's a process. There's a process for being successful in any area of your life. All you need is to work out what that process is. Whether you model it from someone else or you work it out through trial and error, you need a process. So if you have a gap in the steps, you might have steps 1 to 3, but you don't have 4, and you don't have 5, but you might have 7 or 8, 9, then there's a gap and you'll tend to procrastinate because there's the ambiguity is now stepped back in. You may not have enough knowledge or skill, and again, this feeds the ambiguity. There's a whole lot of crap out there about if you can believe, then you can achieve. That simply isn't true. Effective people in whatever they're good at have skills and knowledge in addition to belief. In fact, usually the belief comes out of having solid skills and knowledge. If you think about where you are good, you don't just achieve in that area of your life because you believe you can. You know what you're doing. You've got some skills that have built over time. So this whole idea that you see in the personal development field that all you need is belief is really a bit of an oversimplification. And it's why people, despite all the personal development they do, often don't seem to get very far because they're missing aspects of the process that they need, and they're believing that all they need is belief. That is going to hold them up. People who procrastinate regularly will also have something referred to as an avoidant coping style. That avoidant coping style is whenever something is awkward or uncomfortable, they'll tend to avoid it. So they don't like to fail. They avoid the action. No action, no failure. You didn't try something, therefore you didn't fail. One could argue that you're failing off the bat because you didn't even have a crack. But an avoidant coping style is there's a problem on my left, I will look to my right and hope it goes away. So an avoidant coping style is all about avoiding what you don't want. And typically, at the top of the chain will be uncomfortable feelings. Feelings of regret, feelings of disappointment, feelings of failing, feelings of being put into an awkward situation, which any learning process should involve. If you're going through a learning process, like you're going through a course, there should be awkward moments where you just don't really know what to do. That is part of the process on the way to developing certainty, skills, and knowledge. So an avoidant coping style will certainly help you procrastinate. If you want to procrastinate, that's a good way to do it. And this idea of waiting for motivation, relying on your feelings. If you want to write a book and you want to write a book when you feel like it, that's a 10-year project off the bat. As I said before, effective people do not just wait for motivation to hit them. They take action whether they feel like it or not. So every problem involves an internal conflict of some kind. Did I say every? Yeah, every. So there are two parts of your brain, or well, there's kind of three, but two kind of joined together. The neocortex, or the outer layer, is supposedly where your logic resides. Then the inner core, the limbic system, the mammalian and reptilian brain kind of brought in together, is your emotionally driven system that has the capacity for thought, but not the capacity for language. Whenever you're in a problem space, there's a conflict between those two elements of you. Logically, you should just take an action, get going, shut the hell up and do it. And there's the other part of you that goes, oh yeah, but I don't feel like it. And you're avoiding it. You may do just about everything else you can to fill in the space, housework, whatever, rather than doing it. And unfortunately, because that part of your brain doesn't actually have the capacity for language, it can't exactly explain to you why it's so uncomfortable to you. Yeah? So here's a thought for you. Here's something that we run. It's unique to us. Brigitte, you're actually online with me right now. Just let me give you a heads up. The microphone is on. So we explain virtually every problem through a series of these pillars. This is our Gordian pillars, and here's something that was referred to as the core four. So the underpinning to every single problem is that you don't feel like you're in control. Now, that sounds like a gross, generalization, but it's really true. It doesn't really matter what's happening. It doesn't matter what your partner's doing, your boss is doing, anything else. At the end of the day, if you're walking through my hypnosis door, it's because you don't feel like you're in control. You want to take action, you can't bring yourself to take the action. You want to stop doing something, you can't bring yourself to stop doing it. You're feeling angry and you know that's not going to serve you, but you don't know how to not feel angry. You're feeling frustrated, you're feeling depressed, you're feeling anxious, you're feeling something, and you know that it's not useful. When you have that conflict, then you've got to take some action about it. So the foundation stone of every problem is what's referred to in psychology as an external locus of control. It feels like the control is held external to you. It's outside of you. My job as a therapist is to get you to take back control of whatever you can. That's it. I have all sorts of other devices, but if I don't manage to get you back in control, we haven't got very far. So we have something called GICA. GICA is, the first step is you'll be running some global thinking in order to procrastinate. So you'll say things like, oh, it's all too hard, or I don't feel like it. And those kind of statements lead you down the pathway of not taking an action. You'll be very much focused on the internal world. So the internal orientation is the I of GICA. That is to say, you'll be in your own head. You're not out here in the real world. You're in here, in this world. And ultimately, that can lead you to overthinking things, second-guessing yourself, listening to your feelings that are saying, oh, I don't feel like it right now, and all the rest of it. Then there's something called ineffective compartmentalization. That's the C of GICA. And the ineffective compartmentalization is that you don't know how to turn off these thoughts or these feelings. They're just running. Even if you know they're not helpful, you don't know how to turn them off. That's a skills gap. That's something that I will teach you in hypnosis. The type of hypnosis we do is very different from standard hypnosis. So when you can't turn off those thoughts and feelings that are actually leading you down pathways you know don't serve you, then you've got a problem. And the last, the A of GICA, is this low tolerance for ambiguity. That is to say, whilst you don't know what to do, you tend to just not take an action because you want to avoid uncertainty. That is what we refer to as the core four plus the foundation stone of every problem, in truth. So when we look at procrastination, you add, on top of GICA, you add on this avoidance and this self-soothing. So you may avoid the reality or unpleasant feelings. You often lack the process, so you don't know all the steps. And a lot of the time, I've got to say, the number one step you're missing is the first one, which is to take action whether you feel like it or not. People often say, "I know I've got the steps." No, you don't. If you did, you would have taken the action. But that first one, can you take an action when everything inside of you screams for you not to? That is what's going to get you out of procrastination. You take action whether you feel like it or not. Here's the truth. The world does not respond to your thoughts or your feelings. It responds to your action. No outcome in the real world is decided by your thoughts or feelings. And the other piece is present orientation. Every problem has a time orientation. So anxiety is a future-based orientation. Depression is a past orientation. That's where you're constantly giving yourself a negative post-mortem of the past. But present orientation is for procrastination. You don't feel like it right now, and you negate the future consequences of not taking any action. You minimize the past experiences of not taking any action. Therefore, you can stay focused on that immediate need for the feeling you've got now to go with, "I don't feel like it." Well, the answer to this is to address this, is to go into the future and focus on how you might feel once it's complete. So if there's a time orientation issue, we need to get you into a different time orientation. If you're listening to your feelings now, how about we get you to focus on your feelings of completion later, which will usually be positive. So in the end, it looks like this. There are 6 core pillars of procrastination, plus the foundation stone of an external locus control, or you're just not feeling in control. This is the metaposition. That is to say, it's the overarching, underpinning pattern. This pattern is not you. It's a pattern. And every one of us can run the pattern. Despite whatever our history is, every one of us can run the pattern. So it's not because we had a controlling mother or any of this other stuff. It's a human pattern that we can run. The question is, are you any good at stepping out of that pattern and into another one? Well, the way you do it is to recognize how you're running this one. To recognize it's not because of it's your personality or an identity. You are not a procrastinator. You are running the procrastination pattern. So you might want to look at what are the uncertainties and try and clarify them. That way you mitigate the risk. You step out of your internal orientation and focus on what's really going on around you. Forget all the denials, forget the justifications, forget your story you're telling yourself about why you can't do it, and just do it. Park the thinking and recognize that action speaks louder than everything. And recognize that this avoidant coping style that you might be running soothes you in the here and now, but you're going to pay a price for it in the future. And instead of dismissing the consequences of the future, through the lack of action, you focus on the consequences and the benefits of taking the action in the end. I thought I'd make one other comment about this overarching approach, this strategic psychotherapy approach we teach in the Diploma of Hypnotherapy, is now being considered by many to be the next big advancement in psychotherapy. Dr. William Herfel of University of Newcastle, I introduced this to him. He's actually become a student. He's actually going through the Diploma of Hypnotherapy right now. He's co-authored the book with me. He's a philosophy of science lecturer at Newcastle University. And being so very much across this whole space, he's very much of the opinion that nothing really stacks up to this model. So we're pretty confident that this model is going to work for you or anyone else. It's just a case of how you employ it. So in summary, what are you going to look for? Look for what you're missing. Are you missing process? Are you missing some of the steps? Are you missing knowledge? Are there things you don't know? Can you look them up? Can you Google it? Sometimes we go, oh, I don't know what this is, or wow, I don't know how to start. Google it. Find a way of finding out. What are you missing, and can you find out? Can you fill that gap? Recognize the power of your own action. One of the problems for people who lean towards an avoidant coping style is that they don't really recognize the power of their own action. This is a problem. This is something that you need to learn to do differently, if in fact what I'm talking about is you, a pattern you run. And lastly, action speaks louder than words. Action speaks louder than everything. The key is to act whether you feel like it or not. Effective people act, and in the process of action, they work things out. They develop that motivation because they're getting somewhere. They're moving towards a goal. The people who tend to not really achieve much are waiting for that motivation and assume that effective people are just naturally lucky that they have this motivation 24/7. I can tell you now, they don't. I've worked with Olympic athletes. I've worked with world champions. You know, even I made the mistake of assuming that they must really love training. They did it 5 hours a day on average. In many cases for a decade, just about. And then I found out that they didn't love it. They did it because it was part of the process. They did it because they had to. They did it because they knew the Americans were going to do it. They did it because they knew the Germans were going to do it. So if they wanted to come 4th, 5th, or 6th, then don't train today. If they wanted to be on the podium, then you better damn well train today. So in some cases, it was avoidance that made them take the action, but they took the action anyway. It didn't matter how they felt. They got in the pool, they got on the track, they went there and did it anyway. So that's my summary. Of course, if you want to know more about this, then by all means, let me clear this. You know, how do you find out more about this whole process, this whole approach? Obviously doing a webinar, which you're in now, you come and sit on a class. If you're interested in doing some training with us, come and sit on a bit of a class and just see what it's like. Talk to anyone in the room if you choose. In the hypnosis side, we have 2-day weekends that we're running as a bit of a taster. There's a couple coming up very soon that are a way of you getting a little sense of this and deciding whether this is an area you want to explore. And it's all for, if you get in early enough, for under $500. So it's a very easy initial step. Yeah. So let me get out of screen sharing. And is there any questions that you people have? And I'll see what I can answer. Anything about what I've said? Okay, well, are we in the business of creating a new identity? It's a good question. Are we in the business of creating a new identity? I'm not really sure I know what identity is. A lot of a lot of personal development talks about finding yourself. And I think personal development is about creating yourself. Because in the here and now, you can create whatever you want. No one is a procrastinator. So I'm going to say, if you run that kind of language, whether it's I'm a procrastinator or I'm not good enough or any other limitation, pull yourself up on that, because that's just not true, right? You either tend to run patterns that don't serve you, and those patterns are changeable. If you come and do the work, an NLP practitioner training, a hypnosis training, come and basically re-educate your brain so that you tend to run more effective patterns. That's what I would say. But you are not anything in particular. You're not even your strengths. If you think about it, you're not your physical body. You're not your thoughts, your feelings, your values, your beliefs. You're actually the life force behind all of that, or the presence listening to the voice inside your head. All the procrastination is a skills gap most of the time. You don't know what to do, and you don't know how to get yourself out of that. So I'm going to say virtually every problem is a skills gap. It's not a personality issue. So yeah, I think that the identity you can create for yourself is really whatever you want, as long as you know how to do it. And that's the big one. How do you learn how to be a really effective human being? I'm going to say the strategic model is the way that we work with it. There are elements of it that are linked to NLP, but self-awareness, as someone's just made the comment, self-awareness is the crucial piece. That's the starting point. You have to be aware of your pattern first before you're willing to change it. And in many ways, the more we tell stories about ourselves and the more we justify our position, there's something called self-referencing, where we tend to use ourselves, our own opinions, as the yardstick for how things should be. And the truth is, our perception of the world is just that. It's a moment in time when we decide that this is what we believe. But by definition, a belief is neither true or not true. It's a belief. It can't be proven or disproven. So, yeah, the first step is becoming aware. And I think the pivot point here is to recognize that it's not you. That's the starting point. Look at what are you missing is a really good question. If you're finding yourself not making a start, what are you missing? In some cases, you're missing the understanding of the real risk involved. If you lean towards perfectionism, or you have a really heightened fear of failure, or just getting it wrong generally, it would be easy for you to find ways of not taking significant action, because you've got an unknown level of risk. The more you fear the unknown, the more your risk assessment is likely to be skewed. So ultimately, it's about you taking charge of your own internal space. And that is, without doubt, a skill to develop. We didn't get taught this at school. Certainly didn't get taught it at university. There aren't many places you're going to learn this unless you come and do something like an NLP training, where it's going to be the fundamental pillar of the entire course, is to show you how much more control you have of your own internal space. In the hypnosis training, you're mostly learning how to do it for others, but I mean, you're still learning it for yourself. At the end of the day, the moment you feel like you're not in control, that's when the problem starts. Yeah. What's your favorite pattern, eruption, action, and thought? Well, you can interrupt patterns of procrastination. There's two ways of making changes. You can interrupt a pattern, or you can design and install a new pattern. My leading these days is interrupt the pattern first, but develop a new pattern, and that comes back to hypnosis. Develop a new pattern that you can install in, that means you don't even go to the old pattern as often. You can't never go back to it. There might be times when procrastinating is actually a really good thing, where the party's going, well, I don't think this is right yet, and you're waiting for something, and sometimes that will be valid. Yeah? But there's a lot of the therapeutic space is only about interrupting patterns. It's not about improving or replacing patterns, and I think you need to do both. At the end of the day, if you can minimize that avoidant coping style, if you can improve your intolerance for ambiguity, and how does that start? Well, if you think about it, if you're anxious, it's because you assume bad things will happen. In the unknown spaces of your life, bad things will happen. However, if you think about it, all your potential is in the unknown spaces of your life, of your future, that is. So ambiguity isn't a bad thing. It's just unknown. That's all it is. So when you can change the way you think about these things, your brain won't run these patterns in the same way. How would you address perfectionism? Well, that's a larger issue. But here's the thing. Perfectionism isn't a bad thing all the time. It's context related. In certain contexts, you being a perfectionist is a really good thing. It means you're precise. It means you're diligent. But when you're perfectionistic almost everywhere, then you're scoring yourself everywhere, and you're being marked everywhere. You put an enormous amount of pressure on yourself. And the irony is that people who are so perfectionistic, that are so big on achievement, actually typically, once they get past a certain level of perfectionism, they start to actually underachieve, because they just don't want to take a risk. They won't try new things. They'd rather stay with what they know because that's safer. So it's more about, how do we pull it back on the continuum? How do we not make it such a big deal everywhere? Because sometimes near enough is good enough, and a perfectionist tends to not let that be. So for me, I'm going to work with someone about keeping their perfectionism where it's really crucial and letting it go where it doesn't really matter. And my standard phrase around this is, if you want to be my surgeon, I want you to be a perfectionist. If we're making a salad together, I will stab you with a fork if you tell me I've got to cut it on a 60-degree angle, or the lettuce, 1 centimeter pieces. I'm just going to chop it. Yeah. So ultimately, it's only about context. So it's not about knocking out anything for anyone. Okay. Hopefully, I've answered the key elements of your question. If you have, how do you overcome self-doubt? Sorry, let me answer this one. The question is that self-doubt valid? Start with that. What is the risk that you're running? What are you telling yourself? Is it a valid concern? If you're about to jump off a 60-meter cliff and into the ocean, and you don't even know how deep it is, self-doubt might be useful. So self-doubt by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. The question becomes, how realistic is the threat or the risk? If it's saying you just go to universally, then you need to resolve that. And again, that comes back to the issues with ambiguity and feeling like you're not in charge. People hope for a better future. Hoping for a better future just tells me that you don't have any kind of plan or any structure or any process around it. You don't hope for a better future, you create a better future with what you do now. Someone wise once said that the best way to predict the future is to create it. And so when you recognize that you're in charge of not everything around you, but a hell of a lot of what happens in the future will come down to how you've acted today, then the ambiguity goes out through the window and you'll be in charge of a lot more of your life. So procrastination is a really good example of someone just not feeling like they're in charge of their life or their thoughts or their actions. And of course, at the end of the day, you are. No one else is in charge of it. It's got to be you. So it all comes back to you being you and deciding that you're in charge. If I can leave you one thing, decide that you're in charge, no one else. Okay, I hope that's been useful. If you would like to talk to us, you can call us in the office, and we'll talk to you about what we might be able to do for you. All right, hopefully that's been useful. I look forward to seeing you in another circumstance.